Cold War was one of the most interesting periods of history, an era defined by what didn't happen but very well could have. The threat of the Soviet Union and the USA going to war was so strong that the world teetered on the brink of nuclear breakout for decades. The time of tension was so great in so many key areas: peace, politics, economy, technology, society, that it led to a lot of key changes and events in the world. Without the Cold War, there is absolutely no doubt that the world would have been different. But how different? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that loves a good theory and a good what if. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate, and today I'm asking, what if the Cold War never happened? Now before we get into the video, why don't you guys tell me what you think is the single most defining moment in history? I'm gonna say the dropping of the atomic bomb. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below, and while you're down there, why don't you leave a thumbs up and click on that notification bell so you never miss a big answer. Stick around to the end of the video where I'm gonna be reading comments from a previous one, and also while you're down there in the comments section, why not browse our description box? We've got links to all of our social media, and I feel like you'll love it. The Cold War never officially had a start date, and some argue it has never really had a true end date either. What we do know is that at some point during World War II and the aftermath, tensions between Soviet Russia and the West soured. The Soviet Union made secret pacts with Germany. The United States and the UK developed an atomic bomb without telling the Soviet Union. Then, after the war, the USSR developed the Eastern Bloc, a group of communist states united by the Soviet and a big threat to the West. Ultimately, both ideologies, communism and capitalism, found each other's ideals abhorrent and untrustworthy, and following Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, an unofficial war was triggered: the Cold War. But say that hadn't happened. Well, the Cold War was hella expensive. Just because the United States and its allies never ended up fighting the Soviet and the rest of the Eastern Bloc, it doesn't mean that neither weren't prepared for this. The United States spent $17 trillion on the arms race. We don't know exactly how much the Soviets spent, as they destroyed a lot of records when they were failing, but we know it would have been equal to or greater than the expenditure of the Americans. Now, Soviet spending on the arms race is one of the major reasons for their failure as a nation. They couldn't sustain the money being spent, and many people starved. Perhaps if the Cold War had never happened, both countries would have been economically better off. Although, perhaps if the Cold War never happened, Russia would have remained a command economy for much longer, which may mean that Russia isn't the power that it is today. Circling back to nuclear weapons, the world would have far less. At its height, there were around 15,000 nuclear weapons in the world, and this was directly as a result of the Cold War. Without the Cold War, there would be less radioactive waste from decommissioned weapons dumped in the ocean. Without the Cold War, we likely would not have got a man to the moon by 1969. The USSR and the USA were engaged in a space race, each pooling money and resources into getting to the moon. While countries may have joined together in mutual investments in space, the words Sputnik and Yuri Gagarin may not mean anything to us, and we likely wouldn't be planning our Mars 2020 mission. Let's delve back into tech for a moment. Satellites were very much an invention of the Cold War, but now control the way we communicate across the world. We can thank Soviet Russia for Google Maps, basically. The internet was also born in the Cold War era as funds were pooled into technological one-upmanship. We may have arrived to the smartphone era eventually, but I'd wager a lot of tech created in the Cold War era was done so under the pressure of urgency. Perhaps left to our own devices, technological innovation would have been way slower. Without the Cold War, the Vietnam War would have been very different. The United States of America likely wouldn't have joined. Russia maybe wouldn't have pushed China into it, and perhaps this would have meant that France would have retained their stronghold and kept their colony. The independence of Vietnam further marked the end of the colonial era. I wonder where we'd be today in terms of free nations if that hadn't happened. It is very likely that the Korean War would never have happened without the Cold War era tensions, which would mean that Korea would likely still be unified today, so no crazy Kim Jong-un, but what would we have in his place? What of the Berlin Wall? That's a slice of history deeply created and curated by the Cold War. And what of American relations with Cuba? Would Fidel Castro still have led his communist revolution? Perhaps. Socially, things would have been very different in the United States. Without the widespread fear of communism that came from the Cold War, perhaps the USA wouldn't be so staunch when it comes to capitalism. Perhaps we would have seen a softer Republican Party, although I would argue that the racial divides in the US would have been even stronger without the external enemy of the Russian steamroller to fear. Without the Cold War, the US wouldn't have interfered in the Vietnam War and the Korean War, War. These wars were a huge influencing factor in the hippie movement of the 1960s and 70s. Would there be hippies if there was no war to define themselves against? What would have happened to John Lennon? Ultimately, questions like this are so big it is hard to answer them in a few minutes. There's also the knock-on effect the lack of the Cold War would have had on other countries, like China for example. Would they have developed like they did if the United States and Soviet attention weren't divided? Would a Cold War have developed afresh between China and either the United States or the Soviet? Suffice to say, without the Cold War, Putin and Trump's relationship would likely be very different, as would the mood of world politics as we know it. Who is to say if the Cold War was for the better or for the worse? I think there are some arguments to be made for the Cold War being a good thing, especially for technology and innovation. There were also lessons learned in restraint too, but as with all historical what-ifs, who really knows? For the Cold War to have never happened, the USA would have had to have accepted communism as an alternative way of living, and the USSR would have had to have accepted capitalism. The pair would have had to have been far more honest with one another from the very beginning of their alliance, and been accepting and cooperative in success rather than jealous and greedy. So we're gonna leave this video here. Do let me know what you think would happen if there was never a Cold War, and don't forget to let me know what you think the biggest event in history was. I look forward to reading all of your comments in the comments section down below, and also while you're down there, do not forget to leave a thumbs up on this video and stay subscribed to Life's Biggest Questions for more big answers. Before I go, I'm just gonna read some comments from What If Cupid Was Real, because I feel like we need a little love up in here. Dax B said, what if Cupid was real? Answer, wanted, Cupid. Prize, $500 million. It's hunting time. Yeesh. S. Tigarius said, I don't believe that love is a choice. You know what? I don't know. I think maybe I agree with you. Equestrian Ella said, what if he is real and we just don't know it? A possibility. Okay guys, I think that's it for me. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate. I'll catch you in the next video, but until then, do stay curious, stay alert, and never ever stop questioning.